Well, hey there, family. Good, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're listening to this recording. And wherever you are, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to connect with us here at Champion City Church. I'm Pastor Jason Channels or Pastor Jay, and yeah, what's good, y'all? What's good? If anyone ever asks you that out on the street, the answer to that question is it's all good. And you might be saying, well, how can you say it's all good in the midst of everything we're going through, in the midst of this COVID-19 global pandemic that we're still dealing with, in the midst of all of the natural disasters taking place all over the world, people being devastated and displaced, and with everything that we're going through right now, how can you say it's all good? Well, the Apostle Paul gives us the answer to that question in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, where he says, and we know that all things work together for good to them who love the Lord and who are the called according to his purpose. So if anyone ever asks us that question, what's good, y'all? As a follower of Christ, we can confidently say it's all good. So again, welcome. Here we are today, beginning Mark chapter 16, which actually marks the second to the last message of our sermon series that we've called Following Jesus, a journey through the Gospel of Mark. We've been walking week after week, um, following in the footsteps of Jesus and learning the details of the miracles that transpired there, which has helped us to know Jesus a little better, understanding what it meant for Jesus to instantly heal people from leprosy, create enough food to feed a stadium crowd of people with just a boy's sack lunch, and causing a raging storm to calm down at the sound of his voice, gave us not only a greater knowledge of Jesus, but a deep love for him within our hearts. For the last few weeks, as we focused on the final events of Jesus' life, that is, his crucifixion, his death and burial, we discovered they're not only the most significant events in the life of Jesus, but also in world history. They change everything about the purpose of our lives and our hope in times of trouble. Last week, Bruce informed us of the reason Jesus had to die. Jesus was crucified and died at the desire of a loving father, not out of God's wrath, not because God was mad at us, mad at him, but he was crucified and died at the desire of a loving father who wants to reconcile us to himself. God wants to reconcile us to himself and restore to us the authority given up through the lack of trust that was demonstrated by mankind in the garden. And so today we are examining the most exciting, significant event in Mark's gospel and the most miraculous event of Jesus' life, um, and the demonstration of his authority, and that's Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And so I invite you to follow along with me in whatever transliteration you're reading from Mark chapter 16, verse 1 through 8. I'll be reading from the Passion Translation, which says this: On the first day of the week, as the Sabbath was ending, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jacob, and Salome made their way to the tomb. It was early in the morning as the first streaks of light were beginning to be seen in the sky. They had purchased aromatic embalming spices so that they might anoint his body, and they had been asking one another, who can roll away the heavy stone for us from the entrance of the tomb. But when they arrived, they discovered that the very large stone was already rolled away. And as they stepped into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, dressed in a long white robe. The women were startled and amazed. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid. I know that you're here looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He isn't here. He has risen victoriously. Look, see the place where they laid him. Run and tell his disciples, even Peter, that he is risen. He has gone ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there just like he told you. They staggered out of the tomb, all struck, with their minds swirling. They ran to tell the disciples, but they were so afraid and amazed, they said nothing to anyone. I'd like to focus your attention on the latter part of verse 7, which says, He has gone ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there just like he told you. If I were to put a tag on the text today, it would be the power of his promise. We see described in this text as the sun was coming up on the third day after Jesus had been crucified. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jacob or James, and Salome set out for Jesus' tomb. Mark creates here a growing sense of expectation by narrating the details of the dawning of a new day. He says, as the Sabbath was ending, which points to sunrise, which from a Jewish perspective is the end of the previous day. Mark makes this plain in verse 2. He says, it was very early in the morning as the first streaks of light were beginning to be seen in the sky. The women take off in the dark, and the action or the story unfolds as the sun is coming up. And just as it is rising, the light is breaking on what God has brought about with the raising of his son. The women, however, are not there with any sense of wonder-filled expectation. They have brought spices to anoint Jesus' body, Mark tells us, which means they fully expect him to still be dead when they arrive. The women ask themselves, who can roll away the heavy stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? They were there when Joseph had buried Jesus and seen that he had rolled a stone against the entrance. Their question indicates that they are still expecting Jesus to be in the tomb, still buried and dead. They're acting out of devotion to and love for Jesus, wanting to care for him even in his death. Yet, while they are well-meaning, as the Apostle Paul describes in Ephesians 4, verse 18, their thoughts are limited by the horizons of this present age. They have been with Jesus all this time in Galilee and Jerusalem, listening to the same predictions of his death and resurrection that the disciples had heard. Why then do they expect him to be in the tomb? This impresses upon those of us who read Mark's gospel the sobering reality that it is possible to follow Jesus for an extended period of time, to hear his teaching and his predictions, and even to be well-meaning, but still be messed up in misunderstanding and still have questions. Their question also creates an expectation of the need for someone to act on their behalf. They are not merely asking a factual question regarding a stone, but expressing their despair and helplessness regarding the massive obstacle in their way. Who can roll away the heavy stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Well, Mark continues to focus on the women, narrating their perception of the events. They had come to the tomb well-meaning to do something loving and caring for Jesus, but they did not have any expectations of God having acted on their behalf. They were concerned, understandably, with the obstacle they would face, the stone, the very large stone, but they are about to encounter the activity of God. They are about to see that what Jesus had predicted has already come to pass. We're talking about the power of his promise. The first thing they see is that God has taken care of the biggest obstacle that they had in their mind. But when they arrive, Mark writes, they discovered that the very large stone was already rolled away. Having raised their eyes, they saw the result of God having already miraculously acted. And they are about to behold even more of God's redemptive work. When the women entered the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, dressed in a long white robe. In verse 6, Mark reveals that this young man is an angel. Upon encountering all of this, the women are terrified, understandably so. So Mark writes in verse 6, but the angel said to them, don't be afraid. I know that you're here looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen victoriously. Look, see the place where they laid him. The woman should not be alarmed according to the angel, because God has raised the crucified one from the dead. They have heard Jesus predict his death and also his resurrection, but their intention to anoint his body indicates that they do not expect the miraculous power of the kingdom to break forth and for God to raise Jesus from the dead. With two more expressions, the angel attempts to impress upon the women the reality of what has happened. And he does this in terms of visual perception. He states bluntly that he isn't here. And then with an imperative verb, he exhorts them, look, see the place where they laid him. It is as if he is saying, open your eyes, take it all in and process what is going on here. You saw Joseph bury Jesus in this very place. Do you see him here? No, because God has raised him. His exhortations draw on the dynamic that Mark has developed throughout his gospel regarding the necessity of hearing and seeing and moving toward understanding and sustained discipleship. In order for us to have sustained discipleship with Jesus Christ, there has to be this continual hearing and seeing and then moving toward understanding. The women behold the evidence of God's power to transform reality, and the angel calls on them to process it faithfully, to see it for what it really is. The angel gives the women two more commands, exhorting them to run and to tell his disciples, even Peter. Jesus claims the disciples as his own and never rejects them, even though they routinely misunderstood him and had finally abandoned him. They remain his disciples. The expression "and Peter" may also be translated "even Peter," as if to emphasize that Peter's denial of him 3 times has not canceled Jesus's claim on him. Thank the Lord. They continue to belong to him, even Peter. This is the power of God's grace. By God's grace, all is forgiven, and we still belong to him. Somebody ought to say, thank God for grace. Then the angel tells the women to relay a specific message. He has gone ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there just like he told you. In Mark chapter 14, verse 28, when he had shared the Last Supper with them, Jesus had predicted that they would all fall away, but that after I am risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. There will be a reunion with Jesus in the place where he had originally called them to himself. This is the promise of a new beginning and an opportunity to refresh and renew the discipleship of Jesus. It will be a new chance to listen, to look and move toward understanding, so that they might carry out their discipleship with special attention to the cross-shaped character of Jesus and the kingdom. Yet they will not merely meet or encounter Jesus in Galilee. Mark chapter 16, verse 7 says, they will see him there. This is the promise of perception. They will have their eyes opened to see and perceive, and their ears unplugged so that they will listen, they will hear and understand. Their hard hearts will be softened, and they will do as commanded by God in chapter 9, verse 7, where Mark writes, this is my beloved son, and you need to always listen to him. We're talking about the power of his promise. Mark ends his gospel by telling us Jesus did exactly what he claimed he would do. In Mark chapter 8, verse 32, in Mark chapter 9, verse 31, and in chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus would die and then rise to new life. The Gospel of Mark ends with wonder and amazement. Jesus' resurrection is true, but it seems too good to believe. There is so much hope at this point in the story. The women arrive to the tomb to discover that God has already acted on their behalf. He has invaded the tragic situation of Jesus' death and powerfully reversed it, raising the crucified one to life and inaugurating the kingdom in power. Moreover, Jesus is now on the move. He's heading to Galilee to launch a new beginning. Those of us who read Mark's gospel to this point are primed and are ready to enjoy the continuing dawning of hope as the sun continues to rise and the promise continues to grow, bringing redemption and reversing the failures from previous moments in the gospel narrative. Yet what happens next is bewildering. In verse 8, Mark leaves us hanging with more questions to be asked. He writes that they staggered out of the tomb awestruck with their minds swirling. They ran to tell the disciples, but they were so afraid and amazed, they said nothing to anyone. Now I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to stop right here, and Tim is going to pick up with the conclusion of this sermon series next week. And so I invite you all to join us for our corporate worship service next Sunday in person, where Tim will talk about what might have happened next. Where he talks about, this controversial ending to the Gospel of Mark. But I'll leave you with this last note until then. Just like verse 8 of Mark chapter 16, life will leave you with questions. So when life leaves you with questions, refer back to God's promise. When life leaves you with questions, we need to refer back to God's promise. That's the power of his promise. You see, Jesus shows us the power of God's kingdom comes through his love and self-sacrifice. And the power of his love and self-sacrifice is demonstrated in the promise of his resurrection coming to pass. God's love for us is demonstrated in his promise to us. Let me say that again. God's love for us is demonstrated in his promise to us, and our love for God is demonstrated in our trust of him. The promise of Jesus' death and resurrection brings us back to the garden where mankind failed to love God by losing their trust in him. Because you can't love someone who you don't trust. And so the promise of Jesus' death and resurrection brings us back to the garden where mankind failed to love God by losing their trust in him. And then it reveals the path that God took to win our love and restore our trust by making promises and keeping them over and over and over again. And so what gave Jesus the power to rise from the dead? It was his love as demonstrated by the power of his promise and the promise one. And what will give us the power to rise from the dead? It is his love as demonstrated by the power of his promise and the promised one, so we can trust in him. The power of his promise. What should we take away from this Gospel of Mark and the glorious resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? That there is power in his promise. He loves us. He keeps his promises. And therefore, we can love him by demonstrating our trust in him. We have a good, good God. He's a good, good Father. And we can trust in him. God bless you, family. Hope to see you all again soon. Until next time, grace and peace be multiplied unto you. We love you.